The Battle of Okinawa was between April 1st to June 22nd of 1945, and was the last chance for the Japanese to stay in World War II. The conflict over the island led to the Allies within striking range of Japan. A few months later, the Allies dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima on August 8th, which led to the Japanese surrender on August 14th, 1945. After the war, the Allies and the Japanese compromised a healthier agreement, which meant that the United States would not watch them too carefully and did not leave them in bad living conditions.
During World War II, the Japanese allied with the Nazis, thinking they were joining the winning side, but by 1945, that was not the case. America was marching up troops to Berlin, and the Japanese had lost multiple battles. America wanted the Japanese out of the war for good. They needed to set up bases within attacking distance of the Japanese mainland. America commanders chose a small island named Okinawa, but they were not expecting to be met by Japanese forces. On April 1st, 1945, the American troops landed. The amount of troops that were there were around 250,000, half being Marines and the other half being Army. The Marines were to clear the north part of Okinawa, and the Army were going to take the south part. When the troops first got there, they were met with almost no resistance. The reason for this was that the Japanese leader, Mitsuru Irijima, had set up 3 separate lines of defenses throughout the island. These 3 lines of defenses were made to protect Shuri Castle, which had his underground bunker under it. Mitsuru Irijima might have had a reasonable amount of troops at 100,000 and defenses set up, but he knew he was fighting a lost battle. His job was to hold off the Americans to make time for Japan to get ready for the American invasion, but also, he was to destroy morale within the army by killing as many American soldiers and doing as much damage to the fleet as possible. On April 20th, the Marines had completed their mission on securing the north side of the island with relative ease, but the Army was having a harder time. The Army had hit the first line of defenses, which was several miles to the north of Shuri Castle. The Americans had been getting pounded on this first line of defense for weeks because of lush forests that were perfect for hiding in, and coral beds that were great positions to make holding points. In addition to this, the Japanese had the high ground, so for the Americans, it was always an uphill battle. After many days of fighting on April 23rd, the Army had forced the Japanese to fall back to the next line of defense. This might have been good, but now the Americans had to go through the hardest part. The second line of defenses, known as the Shuri Line, was defended by 50,000 Japanese soldiers and stretched for 6 miles, protecting the capital of Okinawa and Shuri Castle. When the battle started, the Americans' worst fears had been shown. The Japanese had placed very strategic defenses and had every spot lined with gunfire. If the Americans wanted to take the Shuri Line, they would have to sacrifice great losses. When the battle broke loose, it was a bloodbath. The Japanese had 350 suicide bombers that were crashing into the naval ships that were supporting the ground fight. By the 3rd week, the suicide bombers had damaged or sunk 60 naval ships and had made over 3,000 casualties. The Americans at this point wanted the battle over with, so they decided to take 2 divisions of Marines from the north side of the island and combine it with the Army forces on the south for an all-out assault on the Shuri Line. This would turn into the bloodiest battle of World War II.
The Americans at first got destroyed by the Japanese no matter what they threw at it. To break through the Shuri Line, it took about 20 days and 2,000 casualties, but by May 22nd, the United States had broken through the Shuri Line. The Americans overwhelmed the Japanese, rushing into their bunkers and towards the Shuri Castle. After a failed attack on American forts on Okinawa, the Japanese lost too many men to continue to fight back the American troops. America discovered a new determination after fighting through many of the Japanese defenses they were unable to get through before. After the American troops got far enough that Japan saw no hope in winning, Japan surrendered. But surrendering was not considered honorable in their country. This caused many soldiers and generals to commit suicide before being captured and taken as prisoners. Both sides were throwing everything they got into this battle, each side trying to win for their country. But when America gained the advantage, Japan had no other option. The compromise between these two countries was not a peaceful one, leading to thousands of deaths on both sides. Even though captured Japanese soldiers and civilians were not treated too badly, Japan didn't stop fighting the war elsewhere. This led to the Americans dropping nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and gave America a choice. After dropping the bomb, the Americans could have been uncompromisable. They could have done anything to Japan, and they could not have been able to do anything. But the Americans knew from experience that compromise and respect was a necessary thing for making lasting peace. After World War I, the British had been very harsh and uncompromising with Germany, which laid the foundation for the conflict and anger that led to World War II. After all the fighting had ended, America started to try and form a way to make peace between the nations. The Allied leaders of Great Britain, America, and the Soviets discussed peaceful solutions on how to disarm Japan and make sure they could not remilitarize and start another war, but they also wanted to try and stabilize the Japanese economy so that living conditions could not be too bad for Japan. The leaders came up with the Potsdam Declaration, which called for Japan's unconditional surrender, and by August 1945, this objective had been completed. Once the surrender of Japan had been secured, the General of the United States Army, General Douglas
MacArthur,
took command of the Allied powers and started to rebuild Japan. The occupation of Japan was divided into three parts: the initial effort to punish and reform Japan, the work to revive the Japanese economy, and the conclusion for a formal peace treaty and alliance. The first phase took around 2 years, from 1945 to 1947. This stage included the most fundamental changes for the Japanese government and society. The Allies had punished Japan's society by conveying war crimes trials in Tokyo. Also, Allied forces disbanded the Japanese army and banned all past generals from being able to be part of the big political matters. The Allied forces also showed Japan land reform. This was to benefit small farmers and reduce the power of huge farming companies. Next, the Allies rewrote the Constitution, giving the Emperor less power and giving it to the other people. In the last part of the rehabilitation, the Allies set up a peace treaty between the Allies and Japan, ending both sides of the war. After these changes that happened over a 15-year period, the Americans and Allies did not have to worry about Japan's military ending World War II for good.